think that it's time for science to challenge itself, to challenge itself in terms of what is knowledge, who decides what that knowledge is, but that evidence really needs to prevail as a source for action.
I'm here today with my friend and colleague Amanda, who I'm working with at Convene. Amanda is the founder and CEO of Convene, and she's a deliberate dialogue enthusiast and thought leader. Thank you for being here, Amanda.
Great to be with you, Sarah, and with everybody else.
So I'm going to start with introducing the session a bit. The session might be a bit uncomfortable for the scientists in the room, because Amanda and I were working at curating dialogue spaces at the intersection of science, policy, and society. We often work with scientists and think tanks who work on transforming global food systems to be more healthy, sustainable, and just. What we often see in our work is that science speaks extremely well, but system change requires something else: listening. So before we dive any deeper into this, Amanda, before founding Convene, what experiences shaped how you think about change? What is deliberate dialogue, and how did you come to realize that it is a need?
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. So yes, my name is Amanda Harding. Really happy to be in this conversation and to give some sort of idea about what it is that's taken me into the space of setting up Convene, what we mean by dialogue, and where we see science and knowledge creation in that. And I guess I really came into this as a sort of a lifelong reflection. I've been really privileged to work around the world in humanitarian development work, trying to really always look at the system as a whole, to work from anything, as you can see here with the slides we're putting up here, as and the unlikelihood of child soldiers in Liberia actually being able to actually see how transformation for themselves can actually take place, and having that privilege again to be able to actually be part of that. But again, that sort of deeply personal as well as professional touch. So the professional in terms of the work with child soldiers in West Africa and Liberia, but also the deeply personal working as part of the board of the Alexander House just outside of Berlin, a family story which invited us into the village to actually be part of the transformation, using history, looking back to look forward to a more prosperous and thriving and cohesive society. So I guess all of that really points to how impatient I am for change, and not just for change, small change in small places, but really for transformative change, given that the world we're in right now is not looking so great. And I guess that's the sort of 35 years of working in this space. And that takes me to the sense of, intentional, deliberate dialogue, and this idea that the work in Convene really does center around trying to unlock those wicked problems towards actionable solutions. And when we talk about doing that, we just can't get away from food in Convene. It seems to be the space that brings us back. We think about that in terms of a nexus of healthy, just, and sustainable food systems. But we're also thinking about that in terms of this nexus of science, policy, and society. And again, I would say that just takes a community of change makers to make that happen, bringing those change makers together around a table. And it sounds like a great idea. I think everybody says it sounds sort of good, but it's hard. It means taking a lot of risks, and it means trying to move away from this notion of consensus to really recognize power and power dynamics, to actually how we can actually align on these actionable solutions. It's a sort of long answer to a short question. But Sarah, again, I just think it'd be useful to hear from you. We're working Convene in this intergenerational, intercultural space. Why are you engaging in this interfacing? And again, I just want to underline this interfacing space between science, policy, and society.
I guess I'm coming more from a research background. I have been working on topics such as climate change and environmental justice, also here at AUP. And over the last 2 years working for Convene, I had the privilege to be more involved in this food systems work that we are engaged in. And it really made me also understand better the complexity of these systems and the complexity of actually changing things in these systems. So I became really interested in these multi-scale, multi-actor spaces and the question of how does change actually happen? So the SPSI space, the Science Policy Society space, is a really interesting space to look at when we try to answer that question.
Thank you. That's great. And so again, this SPSI space, and I think we're just going to, Science Policy Society interfacing space. And again, I always try and channel my dear friend David Nabarro, who talked about interfacing. Rather than an interface in the plural, talked about change as multiple changes. And I think that's really what we're trying to get to here. We're doing it in a food systems. I'm just going to reiterate into it. This idea of transforming food systems because we just can't get away from food. We all eat it, we love it, we hate it, it's delicious, it's not so delicious, there's a very personal touch to it. We talk about food because we're looking at agri-food systems which do account for 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. We're talking about food because it takes us into biodiversity. It takes us into the core questions of justice. And again, Convene, if it's nothing else, it's really dedicated to actually trying to think about how do we again unlock the challenge of injustice and inequities that we see around in the world today. So with all of that, it means that Convene is working across those different lines, those different boundaries. And I guess for, again, the social scientists in the room, it makes us sound like, probably makes us into a boundary organization. Again, working across healthy, sustainable, and just food systems, could be healthy, sustainable, and just other systems, and science, policy, and society interfaces.
Exactly. So at Convene, our working hypothesis is that effective science, policy, society interfaces are essential for breakthroughs at scale. So if we're talking about the SDGs, or as Amanda mentioned, healthy, sustainable, and just food systems, we believe that deliberate dialogue helps to open up these spaces between these actors. But what we often observe is also that science is very good at speaking, but less comfortable with listening or reflecting on its own purpose and positionality. And science is also most effective when it convenes, when it brokers and provides guardrails and informs these actionable solutions that we are looking for. So as conveners, we often come into these spaces to challenge the participants in the room, to take a bit of a risk, and to consider other people's perspectives. So Amanda, can you give a deep dive into where Convene has been working in this interfacing space?
So I love telling stories. I'll tell a short story. I hope I'm trying to make it short, about some of the work that we engaged in last year through 2025, really building on work that I'd been involved in all the way back from 2019 in the run-up to the first edition of the Eat Lancet Commission. So I guess important to explain, the Eat Lancet Commission is the science report on food and food system transformation, so the equivalent of the IPCC for food. I would say with a twist that it has a very strong interfacing piece to it. Over the last year in 2025, as the second edition of the Eat Lancet Commission was being prepared and was launched in October 2025, we were asked to work with the commissioners, work with the scientists who are providing these guardrails for food system transformation, and to start to pull together 10 communities of specific actor groups from across the world. So, this was 10 groups, 700 people, a whole load of organizations, co-hosted by networking coalitions that we worked alongside as they started to, through a series of very intentional, pretty tricky dialogues, they worked within this risky safe space, started to build trust amongst each other to come out with action briefs, which were launched alongside the Eat Lancet Commission in October 2025. So again, I just think this connection between, we started to see that connection between in reality, how science can be informed by frontline actors and how frontline actors are starting to really be informed by science in a world today which is so polluted by other and alternative narratives, where evidence starts to play a role and where other forms of knowledge started to come in, whether it was from the farmers and fishers group or whether it was from the consumers group, the indigenous peoples group. I think what's interesting, and you can see here that, we took this very literally into a dialogue space at the Stockholm Food Forum in October at the launch of the Commission and these action briefs. And we got very excited when we were able to bring 100 of the members of these communities for action together into one space. The energy was electric in the room. They were brushing up against each other, and the scientists, these are the top scientists in the world working across healthy, sustainable and just food systems. We also got very geeky in doing this, and working with the Stockholm Resilience Centre, we started to really try and map, track and articulate how change actually happens when you actually bring science, knowledge, frontline actors and policymakers together into the same space over a period of time. So as I said, it was super exciting, and it really typifies much of the work that we do, but I guess what I'm trying to say, the work that we're trying to see amplified and scaled through much larger spaces that we're engaging in across those subnational, national and global scales. It was exciting for me, Sarah. I hope it was exciting for you, the work that we did last year.
Definitely was.
Maybe just share a little bit about what you found particular and specific from your point of view about these community for action dialogues.
I guess for me, one of the most interesting things was the diversity of the communities we worked with. So as you have seen in this previous visual, we've worked across 10 different communities, and these were all engaging in a series of different dialogues, which started with online dialogues, a series of online dialogues, and then leading up to the Stockholm Food Forum. And I had the chance to be part of many of these different dialogues. And it was so interesting how farmers talk very differently about change than healthcare professionals do, or how consumers talk very differently about it than cities, and how policymakers have a whole nother way of talking about it, right? So it was really interesting to see these different perspectives and understanding the different problems they're talking about, what is holding them back from enacting change. And another really interesting aspect to me was that all these communities had postdoctoral researchers from the Eat Lancet Commission supporting them in their dialogues. So we also worked with these very, dare I say, geeky researchers who were really deep into the commission, coming out with all these insights and them engaging with these communities and transforming through that engagement also the way they see their own role in helping these people to enact change.
Thanks. I guess what I was just to sort of move us forward, one of the things that we're trying to though really sort of point to today is something about, if science is really speaking, is it actually listening? And again, this is, very much what we're really trying to point to, and do it with, I guess, empathy and effort, with rigor and humanity through the different partnerships, the different dialoguers that we work with. So is it really listening? I guess I'm sort of impatient, as I've already mentioned. And we're all, I think, tuned into a dominant narrative today that actually ignores the evidence. So I think what we need to do is actually think that it's time for science to challenge itself, to challenge itself in terms of what is knowledge, who decides what that knowledge is. But that evidence really needs to prevail as a source for action. We can't actually ignore that. And on food, we're hearing that more and more. We're working with the Wellcome Trust at the moment on a really interesting project, looking across Europe and the UK in terms of what is really needed from knowledge to actually be able to contribute to action on food systems transformation. And what's clear is that what we need more is a political economist analysis of what works and what doesn't work, that we need research to be demand-driven, that it needs to include the users of that all the way through the process itself. And I think most importantly that we need to think about science as a convening and brokering function, as opposed to just being able to as well as being able to actually hand over knowledge to frontline actors and decision makers. And that's tricky and hard. And I think one of the things that we're really clear about, and that takes leaning into disagreement and conflict, tensions, and finding ways of being able to create those science policy society interfaces where through disagreement and conflict, through controversy, we can start to actually understand where we disagree, start to understand where we do agree, to align and work towards those actionable solutions. And unless we do that, we're going to be caught all the time and limit ourselves in terms of the common ambition that we all have for those healthy, sustainable and just food systems.
And this sounds all very incredible and super compelling, but also very difficult to do, and sort of a bit the opposite of the direction that the world is going in right now, where everyone is looking for a silver bullet solution. But at the same time, we also hear the word dialogue thrown in all directions, which kind of indicates that people are grappling to find new solutions to change our systems. So if you had to summarize in a couple of words where this has brought us today, what would you say stands out most?
It's a really great question, and it's a really difficult one. I think that there are two different dimensions to this. I want to be really clear that we need to really anchor all our action in our local contextualized realities. And I get fearful that we have these meta conversations and they feel very distant from real people's real issues. I think at the same time, dialogue itself is absolutely key. And we talk about, and I'm increasingly talk about dialogue as the new multilateralism. In a world where we know that the current multilateral architecture is not fit for purpose. And that means dialogue across and connecting across these different scales. It's easy to say, it's definitely hard to do. It definitely takes a strong human touch, and I'll emphasize the human touch, and it's not to ignore the AI propelling energy that's around us today, but it's to say that let's use that as a tool, but realize that it does need the human touch. It takes shifting from business as usual to business as unusual, from science as usual to science as unusual, the uncomfortable piece that Sarah was talking about at the beginning today. And I think it really takes leaning into those risky safe spaces where science is deeply listening as well as deeply acting.
Thank you so much, Amanda. This was a great conversation, and thank you so much for being here with me today.
Great pleasure.